When we begin talking about the 1980s, we begin to talk about a major shift in the political leaders of our country. Many Americans were tired of all of the political programs that had been started under liberal or democratic presidents, like going all the way back to FDR, then followed by Truman, and then later Johnson. Um, these presidents had definitely increased the size and power of the federal government. They had taken on new responsibilities for the federal government that many people believed should be switched, that there should be less government action in the lives of everyday people. A switch from public action to private interest, meaning that the government should be more concerned about the private interest of its citizens as opposed to worrying about the well being. Less government action and entitlement programs. Any type of government assistance would be included under those entitlement programs, and more community action. So that if a citizen needed help, for example, if they didn't have enough food, a conservative would argue that they should go to a church or a charity for assistance instead of turning to the government. Groups like the New Right, the Conservative Coalition, and the Moral Majority are various conservative organizations that are going to rise to power in the mid 1980s. We also see the rise of conservative leaders like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Ronald Reagan is going to run for president in 1980 against Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had been president and had worked very hard to help the nation recover after the Watergate scandal. Unfortunately, the economy was not doing very well. He gives a speech that comes to be known as the Crisis of Confidence speech. Even though it was meant to boost the morale of many Americans, it had almost the opposite effect. When Ronald Reagan was running with his running mate, vice presidential candidate George H.W. Bush, he asked the question, "Are you better off than 4 years ago?" And the answer that many Americans had was no. Ronald Reagan was an excellent communicator. He had a background as an actor, he was even in various movies, and he was very good at communicating with the American people. His economic policy comes to be known as Reaganomics. His goal in this policy was to cut government spending and then lower taxes that would help to promote businesses. The idea behind this is that you would give tax breaks to businesses and the wealthy with the idea that eventually that money that was saved by these businesses would be given to the working classes either through more jobs, various companies increasing the number of employees they had, or the fact that they would have a steady income or possibly even a raise. This comes to be known as supply side economics or trickle down economics. That idea that you give the breaks to the people at the very top, and then that excess wealth would eventually make its way down to the lower classes. The economy began to respond to these policies, and we did see a pickup. Unfortunately, there was a lot of deficit spending. Remember, deficit spending is going to be spending more money than the government made. This eventually will lead to tax increases and a very large debt. Ronald Reagan is going to make a name for himself as a cold warrior, meaning he's going to take a very hard line against communism. In fact, whereas previous presidents had really worked hard to try to decrease or ease the tensions of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan doesn't really do that. In fact, he even refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. You can imagine that kind of language definitely didn't do a whole lot to help the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Because we are in the middle of the Cold War, he is going to increase our military spending by as much as 50%. He is going to dump a lot of money into a program called Star Wars. It was nicknamed Star Wars, or SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. This was a type of missile defense system. The idea behind it was that it would be able to shoot down any missiles that were coming to the United States before they ever actually landed. He was responsible for increasing our nuclear arsenal. But by the late 1980s, the Soviet system had already begun to decline. There were various domestic issues facing the United States. Both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush are going to appoint conservative justices. One of those was Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Reagan also appointed the very first female Supreme Court justice, and that's Sandra Day O'Connor, who you see being sworn in the top right picture. These conservative justices were meant to offset the very liberal Supreme Court that had passed various cases or ruled on the cases like Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona, Roe versus Wade. This was an attempt to bring the court back in a different direction. He was also responsible for what we call deregulation. Instead of putting more regulations on businesses, meaning that they had to follow various rules or hold up to various standards, he's going to relax those restrictions. The idea behind this was that if these businesses did not have to keep following all of these very strict rules, it would cost them less money to operate here in the United States. Hopefully, it would make them more money and then again boost our economy. And while this did work and it does lower prices in various industries and it is going to be good for competition, it is going to lead to scandals. Because there was no oversight or various groups looking into these businesses, we're going to see scandals break out, one in particular, the savings and loan industry, which had to be eventually bailed out by the federal government so it would not completely fold. The various foreign matters that we get involved in are going to mostly revolve around communism. Again, remember, we're right in the middle of the Cold War. The Iran-Contra scandal is one of the most well-known. Remember, it doesn't really matter what type of leader the person is, as long as they're not communist, the United States will more than likely support them. The United States is going to secretly sell weapons to Iran. We then took that money from those weapon sales and then gave it to anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua. This was all very secretive and doesn't come to light until very late in Reagan's administration. Iran had not always been very friendly to the United States. In fact, if you remember, we just talked about the Iran hostage crisis. So you can imagine how popular it was for the president to be selling weapons to a country who had just several years before had taken American citizens hostage. We were also involved in various covert operations too, meaning secret. We were attempting to try to prevent communists from taking control in Grenada, and we also tried to get involved in Panama by stopping the flow of illegal drugs into our country. Social issues in the 1980s are going to include issues like the AIDS epidemic. Activists were attempting to raise awareness about the disease. The majority of the public knew nothing about AIDS or HIV. They did not know how it was spread, how it was transmitted, so there was a lot of misinformation going around in the 1980s, which is going to lead to a lot of fear. And unfortunately, Reagan really didn't do a whole lot to help raise awareness surrounding this issue. The top right-hand picture is a picture of what was called an AIDS quilt. Again, all about trying to raise awareness surrounding this disease. Abortion continues to be in the forefront of the public's mind. There were many who were attempting to ban abortions, and then you had those who were going to be pro-choice, who believed it was a woman's right to choose. So you have pro-life versus pro-choice. Drug abuse was becoming an increasing issue. Nancy Reagan's campaign to help stop drug abuse was called Just Say No. The graying of America becomes a particular point of interest in the United States. The baby boomer generation, which had been the largest generation in American history, started to get older and retire. When they did, this begins to put a strain on our infrastructure, in particular Social Security. Remember, Social Security, or those retirement benefits associated with Social Security, are paid for the generation of Americans who are working right now. When these baby boomers began to retire, they were being paid for by a generation that was the smallest in American history. So, really, the math just simply didn't work out. The smallest generation paying for the largest generation to retire. This begins to draw a lot of attention to the fact that our Social Security system needed to be revamped if it was going to stay around. Various educational issues also come to light in the 1980s. A report was released called A Nation at Risk. This report is going to compare American students against the students of other industrialized nations. In this report, it showed that American students were behind the students of other countries. But when you look at the report more closely, you know that in the United States, we test all students. Students in other countries are not all tested. It was only your top performing students. It didn't really matter though, because this educational debate about what we should do with our system begins to lead to reform. A debate was brought up about school vouchers and whether or not we should use tax money to help pay for students to attend private schools. The problem with this is that it would take away money from our public schools, which would lead to our public schools declining even more. This also begins the period where we begin to test our students much more. This modern life is going to include MTV, music television. This channel used to actually play music videos, and many Americans tuned in to see the latest music videos coming across the television. The birth of rap music also is going to become big in the 1980s. This generation was called the Me generation, mostly because, as you can imagine, as the title suggests, they were focused on themselves.